Okay, I'm Allison Reilly. I'm an associate professor at the University of Maryland in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. I look at the built environment. I look at buildings, I look at power systems, I look at sanitation systems. And so a lot of my research brings in and research about the environment to understand what it means for humans and what it means for the environment or for the built environment. So I'll talk about some work we've done looking at sea level rise and what the effect of sea level rise will have on communities. So I'll talk first. I just want to shout out to my research group. I have an incredible group of students and postdocs that have really driven this research. So underpinning our research is this lodestar that one's risk to the built and natural environment should not be predetermined by the zip code of their birth, and that thoughtful policies, thoughtful investment, and engineering design can bring holistic, equitable, and just resilience to communities. Okay, sea level rise. You've probably seen a lot of these statistics before, maybe in the newspaper, mass media. Sea level rise will expected by the turn of the century to inundate more than 1 million homes, primarily driven in Florida. This is a report, Zillow report. And you've probably seen pictures like this. If you're familiar with demographer work, like Matt Hauer's work, they then look at, okay, so there likely are often more than one person in a home. What does this mean for migration? If people's homes flood, it forces migration. Who's going to have to flood or who is going to flood, and where will this force migration? So again, by the turn of the century, we expect maybe with conservative climate scenarios about, I think it's about 4 million, 3 to 4 million Americans forced to relocate due to sea level rise, and really aggressive and climate change scenarios, upwards of 13 to 14 million Americans will reside in homes now that will be flooded in the future. A lot of that is, not surprisingly, really driven in Florida, but there are areas across the United States that will be affected by sea level rise. Okay, so housing is so important, and I'm sure everyone here knows that, right? And there are a lot of incredible researchers looking at housing. But my research group looks at all of the other infrastructure that is not housing, often networked infrastructure that will be affected by sea level rise. So what are some of those infrastructure systems? The transportation systems, emergency management systems, water and wastewater systems. All of those will be affected by sea level rise in different ways, and we'll get to those, some of these areas. What it means for provision of service. So like, when will people stop having reliable power? Access to sanitation. That is poorly quantified right now. And if we don't quantify when these outcomes, negative outcomes might occur, we won't be really planning for when people might actually start to move, especially if you say lose access to work and economic opportunities before your house floods. And I just want to note, this is pretty well established within the scientific and empirical literature. One's burden, the burden of sea level rise will not be felt evenly. Vulnerability is a complex term. It is complex and it is driven. People with higher vulnerability tend to be marginalized populations, lower political power, less political voice. It tends to live in homes that are in highly vulnerable areas to hazards, so more coastal lying. And the homes that themselves tend to be of poor quality, either lower to the ground, less wind resistant, less resistant to floods, and they have fewer resources to recover. So either less access to federal disaster aid, which is known to be true, less access to insurance and insurance products, and less investment in infrastructure in these communities at large. Okay, so a lot of my work, I'll talk for just a moment about Maryland. I live in Washington, D.C., but I work in the state of Maryland very closely. There are over almost 8,000 miles of coastline in the state. It's highly fractal. There has been collective retreat going on in the state of Maryland for over 100 years. So we have a lot of examples of it. In the the early 1900s, a town retreated due to just chronic flooding in the Chesapeake Bay. This is a picture I took from my car. This is in Dorchester County, near Harriet Tubman's birthplace. This is just a high tide. It is not typical. Whenever my students go into the field in this area, they always have to check the tides to make sure they're not stranded where they're going. So what has this done? This is forced adaptation. So sea level rise is causing chronic flooding on a daily basis. So emergency management is done around the tide schedule. You report to work during low tides to make sure you can get to and from the office. The state is actively pursuing laws, rules, regs about what to do about sea level rise in this coastal zone. We call it the crab because if you've been to Maryland, please come. Delicious crabs, and it's the coastal resilience area. I don't know what the B stands for. The state is also seeking planning, a lot of guidance, and planning about asset retirement. We are very much talking in Maryland about which roads do we close, do we abandon, which power substations do we abandon, and ultimately means which communities do we abandon over time and stop making investments in. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. One measure that we have used to look at where the risk is really being driven is this concept of isolation. So it's the idea of when you're in your home, can you no longer get to your destination? So we've looked at schools, we've looked at hospitals, fire stations, grocery stores, and the inability to get to your destination due to flooding leads to reduced economic, social, and civic opportunities, right? You're less likely to be able to vote if you can't get to your local poll. This is making the area less desirable to live. We have heard many instances of people moving out of the area because there is chronic flooding. It is suppressing the property values and thus the tax base, making it harder to invest in the area when you have a tax base, right, or infrastructure that is largely funded by the local government or by local property taxes. So what does this look like? If you're familiar with Chesapeake Bay Laboratory, and just imagine if you're a Chesapeake Bay Lab, try to get to a fire station up there. Currently, there is a way to get to a fire station, but under 2 feet of sea level rise, you start seeing lack of access. So we started doing this work for Dorchester County. This is a large county in Maryland, second largest county geographically in Maryland. By the turn of the century, it is expected to be the 19th largest county by size, losing over 60% of its land mass, regardless of climate scenario. It's so flat that it really doesn't matter what climate scenario you look at. So we looked at every single house in Maryland, or sorry, every single house in Dorchester County, and just said under different climate scenarios, when will they be, this is, I think, for a fire station, when will they no longer be able to get to a fire station? We assume some level of flooding that they'd be willing to drive through. I think 10 centimeters is the number. And so when red means they will no longer, during high tide, that means highest high tide of the day, no longer be able to get to a fire station. And the green or gray is no change, and the green to orange means they have to simply drive longer distances. So we can see by the end of the decade, we do expect real chronic areas, especially down here in this island, of complete lack of access without investment in infrastructure, and it just increasing over time. We also looked at this change between the year in which we expect isolation to occur, meaning you're unable to get to your local fire station, and the year in which we expect the house to flood. For 60% of the homes in the county, we have found that there was some difference in time, meaning that it's like kind of the canary in the coal mine, telling you, right, that there is risk coming and that people may adapt. They may maladapt, right, and decide to just buy a bigger car to ford the water, or they may retreat and leave, right? And so we see that in up to about 130-year difference in these areas. Homes that are 0 and red, they would expect it to flood at the same time as their house floods. Okay, so we did this for Dorchester County in Maryland, and we said, why don't we just do this for the United States? And look at all of the counties in the United States and just say what will happen, who will, all the coastal counties, and who will be isolated versus inundated. So we repeated Matt Hauer's work looking at inundation, but then we looked at also who will be isolated under different climate scenarios and for different levels of sea level rise, and found that there is a difference, right? And so with 3 meters of sea level rise, granted a huge amount of sea level rise, we'd expect about 13 million people to be inundated, having their homes flooded, but about 17 to almost 18 million Americans to no longer have access to critical services. And we can look at it at a state-by-state basis. Unsurprisingly, Florida is at the top, but there are states like Maine who are here, that have a huge difference between isolation and inundation. If the state of Maine is only planning for inundation, it looks like their rate of inundation is actually pretty low, and not planning for isolation, people who are unable to get to their local grocery store or civic opportunities, they're going to be ill prepared. A lot of the coast, a lot of the roads happen to be very low lying in this area of Maine. We can also look at how the isolation risks varies amongst racial and ethnic groups. We compare risk of isolation at the census tract level and compare this to the at-risk population, whether it's greater than the proportion of that ethnic or racial group at the county level, to see if there's overexposure. We see at lower levels of sea level rise, white populations are overexposed. These are usually larger homes on the coast, but as sea level rise increases, we see Hispanic and Black populations increase. Okay, so the fun doesn't stop with just transportation systems. Septic systems, right? Our group is also looking at septic systems. This is a king tide in Maryland. This is a house, and this is their leach field. This does not work. You don't need a PhD in civil engineering to know that that is a field that is not working. Okay, so 20% of homes in the United States are on septic. In Maryland alone, there are 52,000 homes that are on septic systems and within 1,000 feet of tidally influenced water. So there are real compounding issues when we think about sea level rise and septic systems. With a high salinity prevents nutrient degradation, so you see a lot more E. coli in the soil, presenting health hazards. The hydrostatic forces from ground level rise, groundwater rise can damage the system. They can threaten drinking water in multiple ways. In parts of Dorchester County, there's only between the aquifer and the leach field, you're required to only have about 2 inches of dry space. Most of the United States, it is 3 feet. Okay, so like huge differences, and really realistically, you don't have dry space between the groundwater and the leach field. Okay, so public health emergencies, right? It can create gastroenteritis. In the state of Maryland, we collect information about every person who reports gastroenteritis at the doctor's office. So we also know whether or not they're on septic. So we're doing research on looking at that. If you go, fortunately, Maryland doesn't have problems with parasites, but in the South, the parasites are a huge problem within the soil. If you look at Loudoun County, for example, not coastal, but chronic flooding, it's believed nearly 50% of the population has hookworm due to failing septic systems that we're not addressing. It also is, you can cause evictions. Now, communities of color are far more likely to be on land that is vulnerable to flooding, not only in Maryland, but in most of the United States. Historically, communities of color are less likely to be granted access to sewer or municipal drinking or municipal sewer services, mostly because of perceptions and ability to pay. Would they be revenue generating customers? This is largely in the 70s and 80s, discussions about where to expand sewer service. They're then ineligible for federal aid when there is flooding because it's a privately owned system, not a publicly owned system. And so we really need financing, innovative policy and financing strategies to reduce this composite risk, because it's really this really large intractable problem that is facing tens of thousands of Americans in the year. And I'm going to add, it is also, as of this week, no longer in the best interests of the United States to continue this research. Yep. So, but we can look at when you have heavy rates of precipitation or king tides, do you have more maintenance calls? The state of Virginia, not Maryland, unfortunately, we're working on it, collects a ton of data on maintenance calls, and we see higher rates of maintenance calls in the periods after heavy rains and high tides, especially about 1 year lag. We see property valuations. When areas are connected to sewer, we see the property values increase significantly. In Maryland, though, we have it's a conundrum. We see property values increase when homes are connected to sewer to an extent that it would justify the cost of the expansion. At the same time, it enables and allows for development in highly vulnerable areas. So what is one to do, right? So there's a lot of discussion about where to expand sewer in a really thoughtful way to reduce risk and also ultimately encourage development in areas that is less prone to chronic flooding. And we can see without innovation and intervention, we will see the number of days that many homes are chronically inundated. The soil itself, due to sea level rise, will just simply increase over time, with parts of Dorchester and Worcester County having multiple days. Okay, so I've talked a lot about sanitation systems. We're doing some work on power systems as well. But really, there is a dearth of understanding of the way residents, people, use and rely on infrastructure, and what the lack of reliable infrastructure in areas that are vulnerable to climate change. What does that mean in terms of adaptation, maladaptation, and how do we plan for where we're going, right? And what kind of science, basic science, do we need to understand those transitions? There's a lot of realities too that we're working against, right? There are political realities. There are biases and like sunk cost fallacy. The reason we keep investing in these areas, we have this sunk cost fallacy, right? That we've invested in this road, we're going to keep investing in this road. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. This is my passion. I hope, as you can tell, and welcome any questions for the minute or two that I have.
Thank you, Allison, for showing us this important research. So much appreciated. We have time for 1 or 2 questions.
So first, this is just so inspiring, and it makes me really sad that your work is defunded. What are your thoughts on migration with respect to isolation versus inundation in your communities?
Oh gosh, we have like a whole group working like that I'm part of on the migration part. And so we are starting to see migration certainly due to isolation. And we're seeing more and more it's the people who can relocate and migrate are the people who do. So when we think about migration, we need to understand where are people going to, will they have a cumulative exposure that is actually reduced risk? So if they're moving to areas that are like the former Rust Belt and we're not making investments in those areas, it's not actually clear that the cumulative exposure will be decreasing unless there's investment in those areas as well. And we have to also think about the people who will not be leaving, who cannot leave, and just simply because of their family has been there for 14 generations, right? Will simply not be leaving. And how do we make investments in these areas so they can still have, you know, opportunity with also this reality of this environmental reality?
Thanks again for such a fabulous talk. And kind of to follow up on that, when you talk about migration and you also talk about the sunk cost fallacy and so forth, a countervailing thing, which you kind of referred to a little bit in the answer to the last question, is the value of an intact community, which often gets neglected when people are thinking about these things. And I'm interested how this plays in the way you think about your wonderful work.
Yeah, I mean, in especially in our work in Maryland, these are communities like literally 14, 15 generations. And so and in some of the islands in the Chesapeake Bay, they're 20 miles in or, you know, off the bay. And so these are places that, you know, really, quite frankly, you know, have this social cohesion and have this purpose and their own identity, right? And so I think it comes into like who will be moving, right? But then also thinking about the infrastructure that remains and how do we make sure that the people who remain stay safe? Like just at least minimally provision of services. And it could be just services in ways that we don't usually expect. Like we see parts of Arizona now, or even, well, one or two parts of the Bay where water is trucked in, right? That's incredibly expensive, but it might mean that water needs to be trucked in to make sure they have access to clean water, or different ways of like, for example, with medication, we're now experimenting in the Chesapeake Bay of making sure of using drones, UAVs to deliver medications because the flooding is too, you know, so different innovative ways of adapting that, you know, really don't rely and depend on the or what the exposure is.
Thank you so